The Empire had conquered 17 star systems before they found Earth. Their massive warships moved through the galaxy like hungry shadows, swallowing civilizations whole. They had destroyed races with advanced technology, species that could bend light and control gravity. None had survived. They believed they were unstoppable because they had never met a race that refused to stop fighting. Commander stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Silence, watching the blue planet spin slowly in the darkness. His four eyes studied the data screens with growing confusion. The planet was primitive. Their technology was laughable. They had not even left their own solar system yet. They burned fossil fuels and argued among themselves about borders drawn on maps. They were children playing in the dirt. "Run the scan again," ordered. His voice was like grinding stones. The scanning officer obeyed. The results came back the same. 7 billion life forms, 7 billion intelligent creatures living on one small planet, felt something he had not felt in centuries. It was not fear. It was closer to disbelief. "This cannot be correct," he said. "No single planet holds such numbers. The resources alone would be impossible." "The scan is accurate, Commander," the officer replied. "They call themselves humans. They have spread across every environment on their world. They live in frozen wastelands. They live in burning deserts. They build cities on islands that sink beneath the waves. They simply refuse to die." Dismissed this with a wave of his clawed hand. Numbers meant nothing against superior firepower. They had annihilated planets with populations in the millions. What difference would billions make? They would simply die faster. The invasion began at dawn over the Pacific Ocean. 100 descended through the clouds like metal rain. They expected terror. They expected surrender. They had seen it 1,000 times before on 1,000 different worlds. The weak always knelt before the strong. The first landed on the coast of California. Soldiers poured out, their armor black as midnight, their weapons humming with energy that could vaporize stone. They marched toward a small coastal town, ready to make an example. They found a 73-year-old retired fisherman named Harold Martinez standing in the street with a hunting rifle. He had fought in a war 50 years ago, a war they knew nothing about. His hands were steady. His eyes were calm. "You picked the wrong planet," Harold said. He fired. The bullet bounced harmlessly off armor, but Harold did not run. He loaded another round. Behind him, doors opened. Windows slid up. His neighbors stepped out, some with guns, some with baseball bats, some with kitchen knives. None of them ran. The commander on the ground reported this to the flagship with confusion in his voice. "They do not flee," he said. "They stand and fight with primitive weapons. Even their elderly attack us." "Then kill them," replied. "Kill them all." They killed Harold Martinez. They killed his neighbors. They burned the town to ash. But by the time the smoke cleared, something had changed. Across the planet, every screen, every radio, every communication device carried the same images. Humans saw their people die standing. They saw old men fight impossible odds, and something ancient woke up inside them. Within 6 hours, the militaries of 193 nations declared war on the Empire. Enemies who had pointed nuclear weapons at each other for decades now pointed them at the sky. Countries that had not spoken in generations were suddenly sharing coordinates and battle plans. They had done something no human leader had ever managed. They had united Earth. General Sarah stood in a bunker beneath Colorado, coordinating the global response. She had spent her career preparing for wars against other nations. Now she commanded forces from every corner of the planet. Russian tanks rolled alongside American infantry. Chinese engineers worked with European scientists. Middle Eastern fighter pilots flew wing to wing with pilots from nations they had considered enemies just yesterday. "They outnumber us in firepower," one of her advisors said. "Their weapons are centuries ahead of ours. We cannot win a direct confrontation." General smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "We don't need to beat them," she said. "We need to make them bleed for every inch of ground. We need to show them that taking Earth will cost more than it's worth." They quickly learned that humans did not fight like any species they had encountered before. On their previous conquests, destroying the capital meant destroying the will to resist. Humans had no single capital. They had thousands. Destroying their armies meant nothing because every civilian was a soldier waiting to happen. A grandmother in Tokyo built explosive traps in her apartment building. A teenager in Brazil turned his gaming drone into a surveillance device. A librarian in London memorized the patrol patterns of soldiers and passed the information to resistance fighters through coded messages hidden in her poetry readings. Commander watched his casualty reports climb with growing disbelief. His soldiers were being killed by farmers with improvised explosives. They were being poisoned by cooks who served them captured rations. They were being led into ambushes by children who smiled and pointed the wrong direction. Every human was a threat. Every building was a potential death trap. "They do not surrender," his generals reported. "Even when captured, they resist. They share nothing. They would rather die than betray their own." "Then we must destroy them completely," decided. "Prepare the extinction protocol. We will burn their cities from orbit." But the humans had been watching. They had been learning. A brilliant engineer in India had studied every piece of technology they captured. A team of hackers in Seoul had cracked the basic structure of communications. A physicist in Germany had figured out the frequency their shields operated on. Alone, each discovery was useless. Together, they were deadly. The resistance launched its counterattack on a Tuesday afternoon. Orbital platforms suddenly went dark as human hackers flooded their systems with corrupted data. Their shields flickered and died as human-built devices broadcast the exact frequency needed to disrupt them. And then the missiles came. Every nuclear-capable nation on Earth fired simultaneously, not at each other as they had threatened to do for so many decades, but at the enemy above. The ships, their shields down, their systems scrambled, had no time to react. Flowers of nuclear fire bloomed across the sky. The eternal silence survived the initial attack because Commander was cautious enough to stay far from the planet. He watched 17 of his ships die in an instant. He watched his invasion force become trapped on a planet that had turned into a nightmare. And for the first time in his long life, he felt genuine fear. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "They are primitives. They fight with projectile weapons and chemical explosives." His advisor, an ancient who had seen more than 30 conquest campaigns, spoke carefully. "Commander, we made an error in our assessment. We saw their primitive technology and assumed primitive minds. We did not consider that a species might be dangerous not because of what they build, but because of what they are." "Explain," commanded. "These humans evolved on a death world," the advisor said. "Their planet has extreme temperatures, violent weather, predators in every environment, diseases that mutate faster than medicine can adapt. Everything on their world has tried to kill them since they first stood upright. And they did not just survive. They dominated. They conquered their entire planet not with superior biology, but with cooperation and stubborn refusal to accept defeat." Stared at the burning remnants of his fleet. "What do we do?" "We leave," the advisor said simply. "We leave and we never come back. And we warn every civilized species in the galaxy to stay away from this system. These humans are not worth conquering. The cost will always be too high." On the surface below, the fighting continued. Humans died by the thousands. Soldiers died by the hundreds. But the humans kept coming. They crawled through rubble with broken legs. They fought with empty guns, using them as clubs. They strapped explosives to their chests and ran toward enemy positions. They were not winning through superior tactics or technology. They were winning through sheer, absolute refusal to stop. General received word of the retreat with exhausted eyes. The ships were leaving. The that could still fly were abandoning ground forces to their fate. The invasion was ending. "They're running," her aide said, unable to keep the wonder from his voice. They're smart, replied. They finally realized what they were dealing with. The last soldiers on Earth were hunted down over the following weeks. Some surrendered. Most did not. The ones who lived were eventually traded back to the Empire in exchange for a promise that was written in a new language that had invented just for this occasion. It was a language of respect. It was a promise to never return. Commander delivered his final report to the High Council in person. He stood before the ancient rulers of an empire that had never known defeat, and he told them something they had never heard before. Earth is not to be touched, he said. Mark it on every chart, broadcast it to every fleet. That planet is home to 7 billion soldiers, and every single one of them would rather die than kneel. We lost 40,000 warriors to a species that had not yet invented faster-than-light travel. Imagine what they will do in a century, in a millennium. If we make enemies of them now, they will never stop coming. The High Council listened. They argued, but in the end they agreed. Earth was declared a forbidden zone. All ships were ordered to avoid the Sol system by a margin of 10 light-years. Years passed. Humans rebuilt their world. They remembered the invasion not as a tragedy but as a triumph. They built monuments to the old fishermen who had refused to run. They taught their children that the universe was vast and dangerous, but that humanity had proven itself dangerous too. And they looked up at the stars with new eyes. They were no longer children looking at the darkness with wonder. They were survivors who had earned their place in the galaxy. They had been tested, and they had not been found wanting. The Empire continued its conquest across the galaxy. They grew stronger. They grew larger. But they never forgot the lesson of Earth. Sometimes, in quiet moments, elders would tell young soldiers stories about the death world and its impossible inhabitants. They would describe a species that fought with primitive weapons and won through pure stubbornness. Never underestimate small creatures, they would say. The universe is full of surprises, and the most dangerous enemies are the ones who simply refuse to quit. Earth had been alone when the invasion began. By the time it ended, they had proven that alone meant nothing. 7 billion hearts beat as one. 7 billion minds thought towards survival. 7 billion soldiers stood ready to fight for their home. The enemies had come expecting an easy victory. They left with a warning burned into their memories. Earth was not weak because it was primitive. Earth was strong because its people had been fighting since the day they were born, and they would keep fighting until the last human drew their final breath. That was the human way. That would always be the human way.